And if they do, they think it's perfectly justified because tough on crime, get them! And it's not just the Repugnocrats who believe this. The Repugnocrats believe it too. And so do the Repugnocrats. So merely voting out a Repugnocrat to elect a Repugnocrat again is not going to change it at all. Now, let's go back to this overall problem of defining things to mean completely what they don't mean and mixing these categories. You'll read about a lot of this in here. I'm just going to talk about my case, and I'm going to go through the lens of my own experiences, especially my current experiences. And I'm going to talk about two things that you probably have never heard about. And one of them is called supervised release, and the other one is called the registry. You may have heard about the registry, and you may be all for it because you don't know what it really is or what this is about. But let's go back to these serious, awful terms combined with trivial things. The central idea of this and my conviction and the registry is the sex offense. Now, of course, you probably think that's rape or something horrible like that, or raping a child, which is even more horrible, and I fully agree. But in my other video, which didn't have any effect, I pointed out that sex offense imprisonments have increased in the past decade, over a period of 8 years, from 20% to 80%. Something is going on. And I'll tell you about how they managed to get more and more sex offenders into prison, or people labeled sex offenders into prison, for the purposes of political oppression. Now, I came up with the hypothesis that, well, the usual technique for political oppression is, oh, by the way, it only became legal to criticize the government at all in 1969 with the Brandenburg case. I believe it was Brandenburg versus Ohio. That was the same year that the Supreme Court got rid of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, declaring it unconstitutional. So 1969 was a pretty good year for more reasons that you think. Now, Brandenburg involved the KKK. Their speech was threatened. And this was really the first time in the 20th century that the Supreme Court said, well, you can't do that. I mean, it was perfectly okay to imprison people for reading Marx and Engels in the 1950s. It was perfectly okay to imprison people, mostly Jews, by the way, for even asking people to think about whether they would sign up for World War I. If you even said, hey, read the Constitution, think about it, bam, prison. And the Supreme Court just loved it. So in 1969, it became not so easy to deal with political prisoners. Well, as we'll see in a bit, they fixed that by imprisoning people politically for drugs, specifically marijuana and heroin. Now, that's going to go away. And one of the reasons it's going to go away is Cory Booker, whom you should have elected instead of mighty Joe Biden. He has sponsored a bill to take marijuana off Schedule 1. Now, the So anyway, this is going to go away. So they're not going to be able to do mass incarceration based on drugs anymore. And so what do they need? What is the perfect substitute for drugs? Something that is tried and true and works every time. Something that worked brilliantly in the 1950s and caused, well, you didn't even actually have to imprison people. You could lynch them. And the answer is sex offenses. And I will remind you that just being gay up until the 2000s with Lawrence v. Texas was a sex offense. And gay people have been executed for this, probably not in this country, though there have been some lynchings. According to Andrew Hodges, there have been 50,000 actual castrations of men for these sex offenses. That practice sort of stopped. And oh, by the way, there were about 40,000 forced tubal ligations of women, but this was mostly civil, so the government could do it to you without even a trial or representation or anything like that. Again, I can't force you proud Americans to think about any of this. So I'm not just going to stop trying, and maybe I'll make the occasional, constant sarcastic comment about it. So anyway, this vast increase is probably the federal government flexing its muscles, its jurisdictional muscles, to try to get control over sexual offenses. And there's a problem with this, and the problem is that that sort of thing has traditionally been left up to the states. States are free to set the age of consent. The ages of consent used to be much lower than they are. An average is about 16. Maybe there are as many states with 18, or maybe a few more than 16. Georgia used to be 14. A prisoner whom I knew told me that his grandmother had gotten married at 13. Now, the federal government used to have the age set at 16, but in, I believe, 1985, they raised it to 18. So, they've been working on their jurisdictional muscles. They've not had too much resistance, but they have to go slowly. Now, the Supreme Court has gradually increased federal jurisdiction. One of the most important cases was Gonzalez versus Rake, which was in the middle 2000s. And this was a case where people growing and using prescribed medical marijuana under California law were put in prison by the federal government. Because even to this day, the federal government can do that. The court ruled that, yes, they can do it. And though it may come as a shock to you, some of you, the people on the Supreme Court in favor of it, the justices in favor of it, were all the so-called liberals, plus Scalia. The dissenters were three, quote, conservatives, unquote, including Thomas, who hardly ever does anything on the Supreme Court, but wrote a brilliant dissent here. And, of course, everybody hates Thomas because of his wife, so never mind. Nobody is going to care. Now, this is all based on the part of the Constitution that allows the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. And that has been changed so that now the federal government has jurisdiction over anything that can be an instrument of state commerce, including a telephone, a computer, The males, certainly, driving on a road, which if you drove it for a long period of time, you might get to another state. This all happened during the Civil Rights era, so the federal government could enforce civil rights legislation on the states. A thing that I'm sure we would all agree was a good thing. But unfortunately, every time you have a law or a court finding to fix a particular problem, it has huge, vast implications toward other things, and you can't stop that because of the way the system works.